Good morning. Today we're going to dive into chapter 2 of the book of Luke in our Advent journey through the Gospel according to Luke. But before we do that, a couple of corrections from things I said yesterday. First, there are only 24 chapters to the Gospel according to Luke, so we will end on Christmas Eve instead of Christmas Day. Also, yesterday I made reference to the Immaculate Conception, and I think it was plain I was talking about the story of Jesus being conceived. However, as a good friend of mine from seminary reminded me, the specific doctrine of the Immaculate Conception has to do with Mary. But I think you could tell from what I was saying that I was talking about the story. And I wasn't making any points about the Immaculate Conception as a doctrine. Looking at chapter 2, there are three main sections to chapter 2. And the first is the birth story. It's the story that is most commonly used in Christmas pageants with the shepherds and Jesus in swaddling clothes and the host of angels. The second story is Jesus being presented in the temple. And there are two prophets there, Simeon and Anna, who both make statements about Jesus. And then the last story is of the teenage Jesus, again at the temple, and where he stays for a few days after his parents leave, unbeknownst to them, and debates the elders in the temple. And Mary and Joseph come back and find him there and are surprised by what he is doing. Things I noticed in this chapter, I've always been and repeatedly am stricken by the statements that Simeon, the prophet Simeon, makes about Jesus in the temple. We call it the Song of Simeon, the Song of Simeon, the prayer that he says to God. And in the Book of Common Prayer, the book that Episcopalians use for worship, the translation reads, "Lord, you now have set your servant free, to go in peace as you have promised. For these eyes of mine have seen the Savior, whom you have prepared for all the world to see, a light to enlighten the nations and the glory of your people Israel." That last verse there, a light to enlighten the nations and the glory of your people Israel, I find to be very striking. Yesterday we talked about the differences between the story of John the Baptist's birth and conception and Jesus' conception, and how John the Baptist's story had very much a characteristic Jewish feel to it. It sounded like the story of a great person born in Jewish history, and Jesus's had more of a Hellenistic or Greek feel. And then we see this verse where it says Jesus is a light to enlighten the nations, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. So I think Luke is again defining the dual purpose of Jesus. Jesus is to speak to the people of Israel, but he's also to open up the promises of Abraham to the Gentiles as well. So we'll have to keep looking at the story as we go chapter by chapter and see how Jesus does this. Does he open up the promises that were made to Abraham to the Gentiles as well? Also, another thing that stuck out to me is that Luke is not interested in the childhood of Jesus very much. We go from his birth at the beginning of this chapter all the way through his adolescence with only one story of Jesus not being an infant. Very short story. And then in chapter 3, we're going to jump straight to the adult Jesus and his ministry. This is different than the way a modern biography would be written. We'd be much more interested in the childhood influences that someone experiences on their way to adulthood now in modern times. But Luke doesn't care about that. The origin of his birth is important, obviously, and the amount of time he spent with it in chapter 1, and in the contrast to John the Baptist's story. But it doesn't spend a lot of time on what Jesus did growing up. So tomorrow we're going to get into John the Baptist and the first stories of Jesus' ministry. So I hope you'll turn out again and check that out. And I hope you have a gracious day.